You think you chose to watch this video. You didn't. Before you were aware of deciding anything, your brain had already decided for you. Neuroscientists can detect a specific electrical signal, a wave of neural activity, building in your brain up to 10 full seconds before you consciously experience making a choice. The decision is made in total silence, below the threshold of your awareness. And then, a moment later, consciousness arrives, not as the author of the choice, but as its audience. What you call free will is the story your brain tells you after the fact. You are not the driver. You are a passenger who has been convinced, very convincingly, that you are steering. This is not philosophy. This is what the data shows. And if it is true, if your choices are made before you make them, then almost everything you believe about yourself requires rethinking. Responsibility, punishment, the entire architecture of human accountability. The story begins in 1964 in a laboratory in Germany. Two neurophysiologists, Hans Helmut Kornhuber and Libet Deecke, were studying voluntary movement using electroencephalography, measuring the electrical activity of the brain through sensors placed on the scalp. They asked subjects to make a simple, spontaneous movement, to flex their wrist whenever they felt like it, with no instruction about timing. What they found stopped them cold. About 550 milliseconds before the muscle actually moved, a slow, negative electrical wave began building in the brain. It ramped upward steadily, like a wave gathering force before it breaks. This signal appeared before any conscious intention to move had been reported. Kornhuber and Deecke named it the Bereitschaftspotential, German for readiness potential. The readiness potential, a neural signature of a decision that had already been made. For nearly 2 decades, the readiness potential sat in the scientific literature as an interesting curiosity, a timing anomaly without obvious philosophical consequences. Then, in 1983, a neurophysiologist named Benjamin Libet at the University of California, San Francisco, decided to push the question further. Libet wanted to know not just when the brain prepared to move, but when the person became consciously aware of the intention to move. He designed an experiment that is now one of the most famous and most argued about in the history of neuroscience. Subjects sat in front of a large clock with a rapidly rotating dot. They were told to flex their wrist whenever they felt like it, but they were also told to notice the exact position of the dot on the clock at the moment they first felt the urge to move. Not when they moved, when they first wanted to. Meanwhile, EEG electrodes were tracking their brain activity in real time. The results were shocking. On average, the readiness potential in the brain began building about 550 milliseconds before the movement. Subjects reported becoming consciously aware of the intention to move about 200 milliseconds before the movement, which means the brain had already begun preparing the action 350 milliseconds before the person was aware of any intention at all. The unconscious preparation preceded the conscious intention by more than 1/3 of a second. The brain started the action before the mind knew about it. Libet published his results in Brain in 1983. The paper was titled Unconscious Cerebral Initiative and the Role of Conscious Will in Voluntary Action. It detonated a philosophical bomb that is still going off. Libet himself was troubled by what he had found. He did not want to conclude that free will was an illusion. He was uncomfortable with that outcome, and spent much of his later career looking for a way to preserve some role for consciousness. What he proposed was a veto. Even if consciousness didn't initiate the action, perhaps it could cancel it. In a second set of experiments, Libet found that subjects could abort a movement even after the readiness potential had begun building. There appeared to be a narrow window, roughly the last 200 milliseconds before movement, in which conscious awareness could intervene. He called this the veto hypothesis. You might not be the author of your choices, but perhaps you retain the power of last-minute cancellation. Free won't, instead of free will. Critics were not satisfied. If the veto itself is also initiated by unconscious brain activity, if the decision to cancel is itself preceded by its own readiness potential, then the veto is not free either. You would simply be adding another layer of unconscious initiation on top of the first. Freedom does not emerge just because you stack one unconscious process on top of another. For the next 2 decades, the Libet experiment was replicated and debated across neuroscience, philosophy, and psychology. Some researchers questioned his methodology. The clock was imprecise. Subjects might be misremembering when they felt the urge. The wrist flex was too simple a motion to generalize to real decision-making. These were fair criticisms. And then, in 2008, John Dylan Haynes at the Bernstein Center for Computational Neuroscience in Berlin answered them all at once. Haynes put subjects in an fMRI scanner, far more spatially precise than EEG, and had them press one of 2 buttons using either their left or right hand whenever they chose. They were asked to report which letter was showing on a screen at the moment they decided. This allowed Haynes to timestamp the conscious decision with much greater accuracy than Libet's clock. And crucially, because subjects chose between two buttons, Haynes could ask not just when the decision was made, but what the decision was, left or right, before consciousness arrived. The results were staggering. Using activity patterns in the prefrontal cortex and parietal cortex, Haynes's algorithm could predict which button a subject was going to press with 60% accuracy, far above the 50% chance level. That might not sound impressive, but the prediction was made up to 10 full seconds before the subject reported becoming consciously aware of their decision. 10 seconds. 10 seconds before you think you decided, your brain has already begun encoding the answer. The paper was published in Nature Neuroscience in 2008. Its title, Unconscious Determinants of Free Decisions in the Human Brain. The Haynes study moved the conversation from half a second to 10 seconds. It also moved it from EEG to fMRI, addressing the precision criticisms leveled at Libet. And it introduced content prediction, not just when the brain decides, but what it decides, placing the result even further beyond the reach of comfortable dismissal. By this point, neuroscientists were beginning to argue not about whether unconscious processes precede conscious choice, but about what that means. And the philosophical implications are severe. The dominant framework of Western law rests on a concept called mens rea, guilty mind. To be criminally responsible, you must have knowingly, intentionally, freely chosen to commit a crime. The entire edifice of criminal punishment, incarceration, fines, the death penalty, is built on the assumption that people could have done otherwise. That when a person stands before a judge, they are being held accountable for a choice. If there is no choice, if the readiness potential was already building before the trigger was pulled, what exactly is being punished? The neuroscientist and philosopher Sam Harris has argued that the implications are total. In his 2012 book Free Will, Harris wrote that no one chooses the brain they are born with. No one chooses their genes, their upbringing, their early experiences, and these, in turn, determine every subsequent thought, preference, and decision. The murderer and the saint are both the products of causes they did not choose. Praise and blame, in their traditional moral sense, dissolve. But Harris goes further. He argues that accepting the illusion of free will actually makes us worse at responding to human behavior. When we attribute crime to free choice rather than to causes, to genetics, trauma, neurology, we respond with punishment instead of treatment. We incarcerate instead of rehabilitate. We satisfy our desire for retribution while failing to address the actual mechanisms that produce harmful behavior. The philosopher Daniel Dennett pushed back. Dennett, who spent his career at Tufts University, argued that the neuroscience of the readiness potential tells us far less than its interpreters claim. The fact that unconscious brain activity precedes conscious awareness does not mean there is no self, no agency, no meaningful distinction between a choice and a reflex. Your unconscious processes are you. They are not some alien force operating independently of your identity. What you are is not limited to the thin slice of neural activity that reaches conscious awareness. You are the entire system, the unconscious preparation, the conscious experience, the feedback loops between them. Dennett argued that the kind of free will the neuroscience disproves, a ghost in the machine, a non-physical soul that initiates action from outside the causal order, is not a kind of free will worth wanting anyway. What we actually need for responsibility, for moral life, for law, is the kind of freedom that consists in acting from your own values, your own reasoning, without external coercion. And that kind of freedom, Dennett says, the neuroscience does not touch. The neuroscientist Patrick Haggard at University College London has spent 2 decades studying the neural basis of voluntary action. His 2019 review in Nature Reviews Neuroscience catalogued everything learned since Libet and drew a careful conclusion. The readiness potential is real. The unconscious initiation of movement is real. But the readiness potential may not represent a specific decision. It may instead represent a general state of preparation, a kind of neural readiness that becomes a specific choice only when it crosses a threshold. The choice, on this view, emerges at the threshold, not before it. And the threshold, Haggard suggests, might be where something like agency lives. Other researchers push the question into more complex territory. Aaron Schurger at Harvard Medical School proposed in 2012 that the readiness potential is not a planning signal at all. It is neural noise. The brain fluctuates constantly with random electrical activity, and spontaneous movements tend to occur when that noise happens to cross a threshold. The readiness potential, on this interpretation, is simply the average of many such threshold crossings, a statistical artifact, not a decision. Schurger's paper, published in PNAS in 2012, reframed the entire Libet debate. The brain may not be deciding in advance. It may be waiting for a random fluctuation to tip it over the edge, which would mean that spontaneous choices are partly random, and randomness is not the same thing as unconscious determination. But randomness is not freedom either. A choice made by neural noise is no more yours than a choice made by unconscious determinism. You have moved from the passenger seat to a car controlled by static. The most radical application of this research came not from philosophy, but from law. In 2013, a neuroscientist named David Eagleman at Baylor College of Medicine published Incognito, arguing that the criminal justice system is operating on a model of human behavior that neuroscience has rendered obsolete. Eagleman documented cases in which brain tumors, lesions, and neurological changes transformed previously law-abiding citizens into criminals. A 40-year-old school teacher in Virginia, with no history of deviant behavior, suddenly began collecting child pornography and making advances on his stepdaughter. He was arrested, convicted, and faced prison. Before sentencing, he complained of headaches. A scan revealed a large tumor pressing on his orbitofrontal cortex, the region associated with impulse control and judgment. The tumor was removed. The behavior stopped. A year later, the behavior returned. Another scan. The tumor had regrown. It was removed again. The behavior stopped again. The man had not changed. His tumor had changed his behavior. Was he guilty? Of what, exactly? Eagleman's broader argument is that every brain that commits a crime is, in some sense, a tumor case. Every criminal has a brain shaped by genetics, early trauma, substance abuse, poverty, or disease, factors they did not choose. The tumor is just a dramatic, visible version of the same underlying reality. All behavior is brain-based, and brains are not chosen. He proposed a model he called forward-looking justice. Instead of asking what someone deserves for what they did, backward-looking, retributive, ask what intervention is most likely to change their behavior going forward. Not punishment as revenge, punishment as recalibration. The goal of incarceration becomes not to make someone suffer for their choices, but to protect society, and where possible, to repair the brain. This model has begun quietly entering legal systems. In 2005, the United States Supreme Court in Roper v. Simmons ruled that the death penalty for juveniles was unconstitutional, citing neuroscientific evidence that the adolescent prefrontal cortex is not fully developed. In 2012, in Miller v. Alabama, the Supreme Court extended this, ruling that mandatory life sentences without parole for juveniles also violated the Eighth Amendment. In both cases, the court was implicitly accepting that the brain's development constrains the freedom of choice, that a 16-year-old is not neurologically capable of the full deliberative control we assume adults possess. Neuroscience had entered the courtroom. Meanwhile, the philosophical debate over what the Libet experiment actually proves continued. One important refinement came from the work of Alfred Mele, a philosopher at Florida State University. Mele spent years scrutinizing the experimental design and found a critical problem. The subjects in Libet's experiments were making extremely simple, arbitrary movements, wrist flexes, with no particular reason or consequence attached. Real decisions, whether to change careers, whether to tell the truth, whether to break a promise, involve extended deliberation across time, not a spontaneous twitch. Mele argued that the neuroscience of wrist flexes tells us nothing definitive about the neuroscience of genuine deliberation. A car analogy. Finding out that your steering wheel twitches involuntarily in low-stakes, unfocused driving tells you very little about whether you control the wheel when navigating a difficult intersection. This is a fair point, but it leaves open a harder question. What if we ran Libet-style experiments on complex decisions and found the same pattern? We haven't. The technical constraints are immense, but we haven't found evidence to the contrary either. The absence of data is not an argument for freedom. What we do have is accumulating evidence from a different direction. Researchers studying confabulation, the brain's tendency to generate plausible-sounding reasons for behavior it does not actually understand, have found that consciousness is a relentless storyteller. When the left hemisphere is disconnected from the right in split-brain patients, and the left hand performs an action that only the right brain knows the reason for, the left brain, which controls speech, instantly invents a confident, coherent explanation. The patient does not say, "I don't know why I did that." The patient says, "I did it because," and then generates a story. Michael Gazzaniga, who pioneered split-brain research at Dartmouth, called the left hemisphere the interpreter, a module whose job is not to understand behavior, but to narrate it, to take whatever happens and construct a causal story in which the self is the agent. The interpreter does not have access to the real causes. It has access only to the outcomes, and it tells a story anyway. every time, without hesitation, without acknowledgement of uncertainty. Free will, on this account, is not a capacity, it is a narrative. It is the story the interpreter tells to make the passenger feel like the driver. Now here's what you do with this. Right now, reading these words, you may feel a rising impulse to reject what has just been described. You may want to argue, to find the flaw, to assert that no, you are in control, you did choose to be here. Notice that impulse. When did it arise? Did you choose to feel resistance? Or did the resistance arrive, fully formed, before you could decide whether to entertain it? The Libet experiment does not prove that you are not real. It does not prove that your deliberation is meaningless, that your values are empty, that nothing you do matters. What it proves is that the model of the self that most people carry, a conscious executive sitting at the controls, authoring decisions in real time, is not accurate. The self is more distributed, more opaque to itself, more entangled with biology than the story feels. Some people find this terrifying. Others find it liberating. If you are not solely responsible for who you are, if the brain you were given, the experiences that shaped it, the neural patterns that generate your choices, all preceded any act of will, then perhaps the relentless self-judgment that occupies so much human consciousness is, at least in part, misdirected. You did not choose your fears. You did not choose your appetites. You did not choose the readiness potential that is already building in your brain for your next action. What you can do, what awareness offers, is something subtler than authorship. You can observe the process. You can notice the impulse before it becomes the act. You can create conditions, through practice, through environment, through the deliberate shaping of your own neural architecture, that make certain readiness potentials more or less likely to build. This is not the free will of the ghost in the machine, but it is something. It is influence without authorship, participation without control. Benjamin Libet himself, at the end of his life, said something that is easy to miss. He said, "The readiness potential does not prove that free will is an illusion. It proves that our model of free will needs to change." The question was, never whether you are free from causation. Nothing is free from causation. The question is whether the causal chain that runs through you, through your values, your reasoning, your accumulated experience, constitutes something that deserves the name. You did not choose to be born. You did not choose the language you think in, or the culture that shaped your moral intuitions, or the genome that built your brain. And yet, here you are, deliberating, evaluating, pushing back against conclusions that disturb you, caring about the answer. The readiness potential was already building in the brain of whoever wrote these words. It is already building in yours, for whatever you do next. Whether that constitutes freedom or not may be the wrong question. The right question might be, what kind of causes do you want running through you? And that question, unlike the readiness potential, you can sit with, for as long as you choose.